My mother always called me the dumb one while my younger sister got a full ride to Stanford. On her graduation day, Dad said she would inherit the entire company and a $25 million mansion. I sat quietly in the back until a stranger walked in, handed me an envelope, and whispered, "It is time to show them who you really are." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The true climax of our family drama unfolded at our massive annual garden party at the Caldwell Estate in Atlanta. Father Roland stood proudly at the head of the long outdoor banquet table. The perfectly manicured hedges and blooming white roses provided a stunning backdrop for his performance. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound instantly silenced the hundreds of wealthy guests scattered across the immense green lawn. Everyone turned their attention to the powerful patriarch of the family. "I want to thank you all for being here today to celebrate with us," my father announced, his voice booming over the subtle background music. "Today is a monumental day for the Caldwell family. My beautiful youngest daughter, Bianca, has not only graduated from Stanford with top honors, but she is finally ready to take her rightful place in the corporate world. Effective immediately, Bianca will officially inherit Caldwell Distribution and this entire $25 million estate." The massive crowd erupted into thunderous and enthusiastic applause. Bianca stood right next to him, wearing a custom designer silk dress that probably cost more than a luxury car. She offered a highly practiced, modest smile, playfully tossing her long hair over her shoulder. She looked absolutely perfect, exactly the way a golden child was supposed to look. I stood quietly near the far edge of the stone patio. I am Raven, 32 years old, wearing a simple linen dress I bought on sale a few years ago. I truly did not care about the logistics company or the giant mansion. I had already built my own quiet life far away from their toxic control, but my mother Valerie could never ever miss an opportunity to put me in my place. The professional photographer gestured for the immediate family to gather around Roland and Bianca for a celebratory picture. I took a hesitant step forward, foolishly assuming I was still considered part of this family. Before I could even get close, my mother stepped directly in front of me. She placed a firm hand on my shoulder and shoved me backward with surprising physical force. I stumbled hard, barely catching my balance before I crashed into a catering waiter. "Stand out of the frame, Raven," my mother hissed aggressively. Her voice was kept low enough that the wealthy guests could not hear, but the sheer venom in her tone was completely unmistakable. "You are ruining the family picture with that cheap dress. This is Bianca's special moment, and you are deliberately casting a dark shadow over it." I caught my balance and looked right at her. "Excuse me," I whispered back. "You heard me," she sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Go find a seat at that corner table over there by the catering tent. This area is for successful people, not for college dropouts and massive family disappointments. Go on, get out of the way before you embarrass us further." I felt the cold eyes of a few nearby guests lingering on me. My younger sister Bianca immediately noticed the commotion. She linked her arm tightly through our father arm and smirked directly at me. "Mom is right, Raven," Bianca called out sweetly, ensuring her voice carried just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "We want this photo to look classy and elegant. You should just sit down before you mess this up like you mess up everything else." The sheer disrespect washed over me, but I firmly refused to give them the sick satisfaction of a reaction. I did not cry or make a scene. I simply turned around and walked toward the small wobbly table near the catering tent. It was a clear physical representation of exactly where I stood in this family. I had barely taken my seat when Preston Vance approached my table. Preston was Bianca White's fiancé, a finance bro who worked at a hedge fund and constantly went out of his way to belittle me, just to impress my parents. He adjusted his expensive tie and looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet smile of fake pity. "Hey, Raven," Preston said loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. "I heard you are still struggling to find steady work. My hedge fund is actually looking for a new receptionist to handle the switchboard. It is minimum wage. But I could probably pull some strings and get you an interview. We all know you are a bit slow on the uptake, but family helps family, right? Bianca strutted over to join him, wrapping her arms around his waist as she giggled loudly. Oh, Preston, you are so generous, Bianca chimed in, her eyes gleaming with malice. But are you sure she can handle a phone system? Do you remember when she was a teenager and failed all her basic math classes? We cannot have her bankrupting your precious hedge fund with her stupidity. Preston chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a helpless child. Just trying to do my part for the less fortunate members of the Caldwell family, he replied smugly. I sat there in silence, taking a slow sip of my ice water. My complete lack of reaction seemed to agitate them even more. They expected me to shrink, to apologize, or to run away crying. They had spent my entire life convincing everyone that I was the dumb one, the absolute failure of the Caldwell bloodline. What Preston and Bianca did not know was that while they were busy playing dress-up and pretending to be business moguls, I was running the boardrooms they desperately wanted access to. I simply smiled back at them. Suddenly, a massive commotion at the front gates interrupted their cruel laughter. The heavy wrought iron doors swung open with a loud screech. Two security guards tried to step in the way, but a tall man in an immaculate tailored charcoal suit simply flashed an impressive badge and walked right past them. It was Elias Thorne, one of the most ruthless and high-powered corporate lawyers on Wall Street. The music stopped abruptly. The chatter died down as hundreds of eyes watched Elias stride confidently across the manicured lawn. He completely ignored Roland and Valerie. He walked right past Preston and Bianca as if they were invisible. Elias walked straight to my wobbly little corner table. He stopped in front of me and offered a deep, respectful bow, something no one in this family had ever shown me. The entire garden was dead silent. Elias reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with bright red wax. He held it out to me with both hands. "It is time to show them who you really are, Miss Caldwell," he whispered softly. Before I could even reach for the envelope, my mother Valerie let out a dramatic shriek and sprinted across the patio toward us. "What is the meaning of this?" Valerie screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Elias. "Are you a debt collector? Raven, did you borrow money from loan sharks to buy more of your cheap garbage? Are you trying to bring thugs into our home and ruin your sister Big Day? You are an absolute disgrace to this family." I had barely settled into the wobbly plastic chair at my designated corner table when a tall shadow fell across my lap. I looked up and saw Preston Vance standing over me. Preston was Bianca White's fiancé, and he was the textbook definition of a corporate finance bro. He worked at a mid-tier hedge fund downtown and spent most of his time desperately trying to impress my wealthy parents by adopting their disdain for me. He stood there in his expensive tailored suit, adjusting his silk tie, with a sickeningly condescending smile plastered across his face. He leaned in close enough for me to smell his overwhelming designer cologne. "Hey there, Raven," he said loudly, making sure the guests at the nearby tables could hear him. "I was talking to your father earlier, and I heard you are still struggling to find steady work. It is a tough economy out there, especially for someone without a degree." I did not answer him. I just stared at his perfectly styled hair and waited for the punchline. Preston chuckled softly, as if we were sharing a private joke. "Listen," he continued, resting his hand on our table. "My hedge fund is actually expanding, and we are looking for a new receptionist to handle the front switchboard. It is only minimum wage, of course, but I could probably pull some strings with human resources and get you an interview. We all know you are a bit slow on the uptake, but family helps family, right? I figure it is the least I can do to help out the slow member of the Caldwell clan." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his offer, I heard the clicking of designer heels on the stone patio. Bianca strutted over to join him, wrapping her slender arms around his waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder and giggled loudly. "Oh, Preston, you are far too generous," my sister chimed in, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple dress before turning her attention back to her fiancé. But are you absolutely sure she can even handle a basic phone system, Preston? Do you remember when she was a teenager and failed all those basic math classes? Bianca laughed again, a sharp, piercing sound that grated on my nerves. She used to get sent to after-school detention just to practice spelling words because she could not even string a proper sentence together. We cannot have her bankrupting your precious hedge fund by misplacing important client messages just because she forgot how to spell. Preston threw his head back and laughed, shaking his head as if I were a helpless toddler. Just trying to do my part for the less fortunate members of the family, he replied smugly. It is important to give back to the community after all, even if that community is sitting right here at our own party. The blatant racial microaggressions masked as pity were nothing new from Preston. He always found a way to subtly remind me that he viewed himself as a savior gracing our family with his presence. He loved the fact that my parents were wealthy, but he loved it even more that they allowed him to treat their oldest daughter like trash. Several guests sitting nearby turned their heads to watch the interaction. I could feel their judging eyes on my skin. They were waiting for me to snap. They wanted me to throw my drink in his face or scream at my sister so they could point their fingers and call me crazy. They wanted the angry stereotype. They wanted to justify why my parents treated me like an outcast. But I refused to give them the sick satisfaction of a reaction. I sat there in complete silence. I reached for my glass of ice water and took a slow, deliberate sip. My complete lack of emotional response seemed to agitate them even more. Bianca dropped her fake smile and glared at me. Her jaw clenched tight. They expected me to shrink into myself to apologize for my existence or to run away crying into the gardens. They had spent my entire life convincing everyone in our social circle that I was the dumb one. The absolute failure of the prestigious Caldwell bloodline. What Preston and Bianca did not know was that while they were busy playing dress-up and pretending to be powerful business moguls, I was actually running the very boardrooms they so desperately wanted access to. I simply placed my glass back on the table, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled right back at them with a calm, chilling confidence. You might want to worry less about my spelling, Bianca, I said softly, keeping my voice steady and perfectly leveled. And maybe Preston should worry a little more about his own numbers. Preston frowned, his smug expression faltering for a brief second. What is that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone suddenly defensive. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly not expecting any pushback from the family punching bag. Bianca scoffed and rolled her eyes. Do not listen to her, Preston. She is just jealous that you are successful, and she is sitting here drinking tap water alone. I let them have the last word for the moment. It was fascinating to watch them operate in their little bubble of delusion. Preston truly believed his entry-level management position at a failing hedge fund made him the smartest man in the room. He walked around our estate with a sense of unearned ownership, constantly making passive-aggressive comments about the neighborhood or the catering staff. He thought he was untouchable because my father, Roland, practically worshipped the ground he walked on. My parents were so obsessed with the idea of having a white finance executive in the family that they completely ignored his blatant disrespect. To them, Preston was the ultimate prize for their golden child, Bianca. He was the final piece of the puzzle that made their picture-perfect American dream complete. It did not matter that he talked down to me. It did not matter that he made snide remarks about my natural hair or my clothing. As long as he wore a suit and carried a briefcase, my parents were willing to turn a blind eye to his toxicity, and Bianca reveled in it. She loved having a partner who validated her cruelty. Growing up, she had always needed an audience for her bullying. She would wait until our parents were watching before making fun of my grades or my lack of friends. Now she had a fiancé who joined in on the torment, making her feel even more powerful and justified in her hatred toward me. They stood there holding hands, a united front of arrogance and privilege, waiting for me to break down. I looked at Preston and noticed a small sweat stain forming on the collar of his expensive dress shirt. For all his boasting and posturing, the man was constantly stressed. I knew exactly why he was sweating, and it had nothing to do with the Georgia heat. But it was not time to reveal my hand just yet. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing their mocking smiles to slowly turn into expressions of uneasy confusion. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing their mocking smiles to slowly turn into expressions of uneasy confusion. I took another calm sip of my ice water, holding my wobbly plastic cup with perfectly steady hands. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break eye contact with Preston. He shifted his weight again, clearing his throat as if he wanted to say something else to reassert his dominance, but the words completely died in his throat. Bianca opened her mouth to hurl another cruel insult at me, but she was suddenly cut off by a massive commotion at the front gates of the estate. The heavy wrought iron doors at the entrance swung open with a loud metallic screech that echoed across the perfectly manicured lawn. Two burly security guards in dark suits moved quickly, trying to block the entrance. But a tall man in an immaculate tailored charcoal suit simply stepped past them without even breaking his stride. He did not look at the guards. He just flashed a solid black leather credential case and kept walking with an air of absolute authority. It was Elias Thorne. Anyone who knew anything about corporate law in New York or Atlanta knew exactly who he was. He was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and high-powered law firms on Wall Street. A man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers before his morning coffee. A man whose mere presence in a boardroom usually meant someone was about to lose their entire company. The elegant string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The joyful chatter of the wealthy guests died down instantly as hundreds of eyes watched Elias stride confidently across the green grass. My father, Roland, puffed out his chest and took a confident step forward. He fully expected this incredibly important man to be here for him. He plastered on his best fake corporate smile, ready to shake hands and welcome a new, powerful connection to his daughter's graduation party. But Elias completely ignored my father. He walked right past Roland, without even a sideways glance. He walked right past a bewildered Valerie who had her hand outstretched. He brushed past Preston and Bianca as if they were nothing more than invisible statues in the garden. The sheer disrespect to the golden child and the proud family patriarch was absolutely beautiful to witness. Elias walked straight toward my wobbly little plastic table in the dirty corner of the catering tent. He stopped directly in front of me and offered a deep, respectful bow. It was a gesture of profound reverence. It was something no one in this family had ever shown me in my entire 32 years of life. The entire garden went completely dead silent. You could hear the warm Georgia wind rustling through the leaves of the oak trees. Elias reached into his premium leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of expensive parchment paper and sealed tightly with bright red wax. He held it out to me using both hands, treating it like it was the most valuable object in the world. "It is time to show them who you really are, Miss Caldwell," he whispered softly, his deep voice carrying just enough for my immediate family to hear. Before my fingers could even touch the thick parchment, my mother Valerie let out a dramatic, piercing shriek. She sprinted across the stone patio, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the ground. "What is the meaning of this?" she screamed, her face turning red with sudden rage and deep embarrassment. She lunged forward violently, trying to snatch the red-sealed envelope right out of Elias' hands. But he was too quick. He smoothly stepped back, shielding the document from her frantic grasp. Valerie pointed a shaking manicured finger at him, and then turned her furious eyes on me. "Are you a debt collector?" she yelled at Elias, her voice cracking with hysteria. She spun around to face me, leaning over my small table. "Raven, did you borrow money from dangerous loan sharks to buy more of your cheap garbage?" she demanded. "Are you trying to bring street thugs into our beautiful home and ruin your sister Big Day?" The wealthy guests began whispering furiously among themselves, craning their necks to get a better view of the drama. Valerie was completely losing her mind. She was so blinded by her lifelong hatred for me that she truly believed this high-powered Wall Street attorney was a petty street thug coming to collect a bad debt. "You are an absolute disgrace to this family," Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured victimhood. "You could not just sit quietly in your corner and let Bianca have one perfect moment, could you? You always have to ruin everything for us. Roland marched over, his face flushed dark purple with anger. He aggressively signaled for the security guards who were awkwardly hovering near the gate, unsure of what to do. "Get this man off my property immediately," Roland ordered, trying desperately to project his usual authority. "This is a private celebration for my successful daughter, and we will not have some low-life debt collector harassing my family in front of our esteemed guests." Elias did not flinch. He slowly turned his head to look at my father. His expression was so cold and intensely indifferent that it made Roland physically take a half step back. "I assure you, Mr. Caldwell," Elias said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm, "I am not a debt collector. And if your poorly trained security guards lay a single finger on my suit, your failing distribution company will be facing a lawsuit so massive it will make your current financial problems look like absolute child's play." Preston's eyes went wide at the sudden mention of financial problems. He looked at Roland and then back to Elias, trying frantically to process what was happening. The fake pity on Preston's face was entirely gone, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Bianca gripped Preston's arm tightly, her perfect smile replaced by an ugly scowl of confusion. I remained completely seated, keeping my posture relaxed and unbothered. I finally reached out and took the envelope from Elias. The red wax felt smooth and cool against my fingertips. The weight of the parchment was substantial. It was the heavy weight of 10 years of silent sacrifices, late nights, and relentless hard work. It was the physical manifestation of my revenge. Valerie's chest was heaving as she struggled to breathe. She looked around at her wealthy country club friends, watching her perfect, flawless image crack into pieces in real time. She hated me more in that specific moment than she ever had before. She hated that the spotlight was no longer firmly fixed on her precious golden child, Bianca. She hated that a man wearing a bespoke $5,000 suit was bowing to the broken daughter she had proudly cast aside. "What exactly is in that envelope, Raven?" my father demanded, his voice completely losing its confident boom. "Open it right now and explain why this corporate lawyer is standing in my garden, or I swear I will have you both thrown out onto the street with the rest of the trash." I looked down at the bright red wax seal resting in my hands. I looked up at my younger sister, who was now clutching her fiancé's arm with white knuckles. And then I looked at my mother, who was still breathing heavily, glaring at me like a trapped, vicious animal. "I am not throwing anything away," I thought to myself, with a quiet sense of peace. "I am just taking out the trash." I looked away from my mother and her pathetic glaring. I slowly stood up from my wobbly plastic chair, holding the heavy sealed envelope in my left hand. Valerie tried to step into my personal space again, to intimidate me, to force me back down into my designated role as the family loser. But I simply brushed past her, as if she were nothing more than a mild breeze. She gasped in offense, but I did not look back. I did not even bother acknowledging my father's desperate demands to open the envelope. Instead, I turned my full attention directly to Preston. He was still standing there, trying to maintain his posture of superiority, but the nervous sweat on his collar was spreading rapidly. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking around at the guests to make sure they were still paying attention. I offered him a very slow and very cold smile. It was the kind of smile that made people realize they were suddenly standing on a fragile trapdoor. "You seem remarkably concerned about the financial well-being of my family." "Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and clear so that the wealthy guests around us could hear every single word. "You talk a lot about helping out the less fortunate and giving me a minimum wage job at your prestigious hedge fund. You love playing the generous savior for everyone here to see." Preston shifted uncomfortably on his expensive leather shoes. He tried to force a condescending chuckle, but it sounded hollow and incredibly weak. "Well, yes," he stammered slightly, his eyes darting toward Roland for support. "We all have to do our part, Raven. I am just trying to be a good future brother-in-law." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. "That is so incredibly generous of you," I replied, tilting my head slightly. "But I am just a bit confused about the logistics of your offer. How exactly are you planning to pay my minimum wage salary when your hedge fund is currently $4 million in the red?" The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The gentle rustling of the wind seemed to stop entirely. The fake smile on Preston's face dropped so fast it was almost comical. The smug, confident finance bro mask completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the entire Atlanta elite. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to call me crazy, but nothing came out except a pathetic wheezing sound. I did not let him recover. I did not give him a single second to spin a lie. I raised my voice just a fraction, ensuring the wealthy country club members and corporate investors sitting at the nearby tables caught the rest of the devastating information. In fact, Preston, I am very curious to know how you are managing any payroll at all, considering the Securities and Exchange Commission officially opened a federal investigation into your firm for massive wire fraud just 72 hours ago. The massive garden erupted into shocked and horrified murmurs. Wealthy socialites gasped loudly and covered their mouths. Men in expensive tailored suits immediately leaned in, whispering furiously to one another, pulling out their phones to check the financial news. Some of the guests at the party were likely investors in his fund, and the sheer panic on their faces was priceless. The Caldwell family reputation was built entirely on smoke and mirrors, and I had just thrown a lit match right into the center of it. Preston's skin turned the color of spoiled milk. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and terrified. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into the catering buffet table and rattling the silver chafing dishes. "That is a complete lie," he stuttered wildly, looking around at the judging eyes of the guests with pure desperation. "You are making this up. You are just a crazy, jealous dropout trying to ruin my life because you have nothing going for you." I smiled warmly at his frantic panic. "Am I Preston?" I asked softly. "Because my legal team has a verified copy of the federal subpoena. It turns out that moving client money into offshore shell companies leaves a rather obvious paper trail, even for someone as incredibly smart as you claim to be. The FBI is probably boxing up your office files as we speak." My mother Valerie let out a strange choking noise, as if all the air had been violently punched out of her lungs. My father Roland stood entirely frozen, his jaw practically resting on his chest. They had spent years worshipping this ordinary, arrogant man, viewing him as the ultimate prize who would elevate their social status. They had allowed him to mock their own flesh and blood. Now they were realizing in real time that he was nothing more than a desperate broke criminal wearing a nice suit. But it was Bianca who finally broke the trance. Her perfect fairy tale graduation day, the day she was supposed to be crowned. The ultimate golden child was being incinerated right in front of her eyes. The handsome, wealthy fiancé she loved to parade around to make her friends jealous was being exposed as a massive fraud by the very sister she had spent her entire life tormenting. Bianca let out a primal scream of pure, unadulterated rage. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred, stripping away all the elegance and class she pretended to possess. "You lying, bitter failure!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, completely losing her mind. She lunged at me with her arm raised high, aiming a vicious closed hand slap right at my face. Her custom designer silk dress twisted awkwardly as she threw her entire body weight into the violent strike, hoping to knock me to the ground. I did not even flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I just stood there and watched her unravel. Before Bianca's hand could even come close to my cheek, Elias Thorne moved with terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly between us and caught Bianca's wrist mid-air. His grip was firm and utterly immovable, halting her frantic attack instantly. Bianca gasped in shock, struggling wildly against his hold like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. "Let go of me!" she screamed, kicking her expensive heels against the stone patio. "Let me teach this piece of trash a lesson right now." Elias looked down at my sister with a mixture of profound pity and severe warning. "I would strongly advise against assaulting my client in front of hundreds of witnesses, Miss Caldwell," he said, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through her hysterical screaming like a sharp blade. "Unless, of course, you would like to add criminal battery to the very long list of severe legal problems your family is about to face today." He released her wrist with a quick, dismissive flick. Bianca stumbled backward, losing her balance and falling right into Preston's arms. She looked at her wrist, which was now flushed red from Elias' iron grip, and then looked up at me with tears of absolute fury streaming down her carefully contoured face. The golden child was completely broken. The perfect facade was permanently destroyed, and they had nobody to blame but themselves. I looked at the three of them clustered together in their panic and public humiliation. They thought this was the end of the embarrassment. They thought exposing Preston was the grand finale of my revenge. But the brutal truth was, I was only just getting started. The real ugly secrets were still buried in the past, and the heavy red envelope in my hand was about to dig them all up for the whole world to see. Valerie could not handle the massive shift in power that was happening right in front of her. She saw her precious golden child sobbing uncontrollably, and her perfect future son-in-law exposed as a federal criminal facing serious prison time. Instead of accepting the harsh reality of the situation, my mother did what she always did when she was backed into a corner. She went on a vicious offensive attack. She stomped her expensive designer heels against the stone patio and pushed her way past Elias, placing herself directly between me and her precious Bianca, like a mother bear protecting her cub. "You are completely out of your mind!" Valerie screamed, her voice echoing loudly across the silent garden and bouncing off the walls of the $25 million mansion. "You think you can just come here with your fake lawyers and your fabricated government documents and ruin this beautiful day for our family? You are just jealous, Raven. You have always been so insanely jealous of your sister and her success." I tilted my head, feigning a look of mild amusement. "Jealous of what exactly, Mother?" I asked smoothly. Valerie let out a bitter, condescending laugh, tossing her manicured hands in the air. "Jealous of absolutely everything," she yelled, gesturing wildly toward Preston, who was currently wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand, looking like he was about to pass out on the grass. "You are jealous that Bianca secured a prestigious catch like Preston while you are completely alone and unlovable. You are jealous that she graduated at the top of her class from Stanford today with honors, while you are nothing but a pathetic dropout." The wealthy guests leaned in closer, absorbing every single drop of the escalating family drama. Valerie was so incredibly unhinged that she did not even care she was airing our dirty laundry in public anymore. She just wanted to destroy me emotionally right then and there. She wanted to restore the natural order of the Caldwell household, where I was the ultimate punching bag, and Bianca was the flawless angel. "Do not stand there and act like you are somehow better than us," Valerie continued, her face twisting with raw, unadulterated hostility. "Everyone standing here on this lawn knows exactly who and what you are, Raven. You are the failure of this family. When you were 19 years old, you flunked out of your basic college classes because you were simply too stupid to keep up with the curriculum. We gave you absolutely everything a child could ever want, and you threw it all away because you were lazy." She took a threatening step toward me, pointing her finger right at my chest, her eyes blazing with a toxic fury. "We had to kick you out of this house because we could not bear the deep embarrassment of having such a useless daughter living under our roof, eating our food and wasting our resources. You have done absolutely nothing with your life for the past 13 years. You will always be the ultimate stain on the Caldwell name. You are nothing but a massive disappointment, and no amount of fake Wall Street lawyers will ever change the fact that you are a total fraud trying to bring us down to your miserable level." The sheer vitriol in her voice was supposed to break me into a million pieces. It was the exact same harsh, demeaning tone she had used to terrorize me when I was a vulnerable teenager. She fully expected me to lower my eyes to apologize for my existence, or to run away in tears just like I used to do when I was 19 and completely financially dependent on their toxic approval. My father, Roland, stood entirely silent behind her, nodding along in agreement, letting his wife do the dirty work of putting the family scapegoat back in her proper place. But I was no longer that scared 19-year-old girl crying alone in her pale blue bedroom, wishing for a mother who actually loved her. The cruel words that used to cut me so deeply now just sounded like the pathetic ramblings of a desperate woman losing her grip on reality. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I did not flinch or back down a single inch. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was a smile of pure, calculated victory, and it made Valerie falter for a fraction of a second. Her pointing finger slowly lowered as she realized her harsh words were having absolutely no emotional effect on me whatsoever. "You are right about one thing, Valerie," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and remarkably steady. "I did leave this house when I was 19 years old. But the rest of your little fairy tale is wildly inaccurate and honestly quite insulting to my intelligence." I reached down and unlatched my simple linen purse. I did not pull out the red wax-sealed envelope that Elias had just handed me. That was for later. Instead, I reached deep inside and pulled out something much older and far more dangerous to their carefully constructed lies. It was a thick, battered leather ledger. The edges of the heavy pages were yellowed and frayed from years of constant use. The dark brown cover was heavily worn down, carrying the unmistakable weight of genuine family history and undeniable truth. Roland's eyes instantly locked onto the old book, and all the color aggressively drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His confident, patriarchal posture completely collapsed in on itself. He knew exactly what that ledger was. It belonged to my late grandfather, the man who had actually built the Caldwell legacy from the ground up with his bare hands, before my father took over and nearly ran it into the ground with his sheer incompetence and endless vanity. "What are you doing with that?" Roland demanded, his voice trembling with a sudden overwhelming panic that he could not hide from the crowd. "Where did you get that book?" Raven put it away right now. I held the battered ledger up for everyone to see, running my hand over the worn leather cover with a deep sense of reverence. "My grandfather was a very smart man," I explained loudly, making sure every single country club member and corporate investor on the lawn heard me clearly. He did not trust his own son to handle the family finances properly. So before he passed away, he kept meticulous private records of every single trust fund, every bank account, and every asset that belonged to the Caldwell estate. He documented every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. Valerie swallowed hard, looking frantically between the old ledger and my father. She tried to maintain her fierce, intimidating facade, but the sudden terror radiating from Roland was highly contagious. The realization that their darkest secrets were physically sitting in my hands was beginning to suffocate them both. "You love telling everyone the dramatic story of how I failed out of college." "Mother," I continued, my voice carrying a sharp, lethal edge that cut through the warm afternoon air. "You love telling your wealthy country club friends that I was simply too stupid to pass my final exams and that you had to kick me out to protect the family honor. You built an entire narrative around my supposed failure to elevate your precious Bianca. But that is not really what happened, is it?" I slowly opened the old heavy ledger to a specific page that I had bookmarked with a bright red ribbon. I looked down at the neatly handwritten numbers, tracing my finger along the faded ink of my grandfather's meticulous accounting. "The truth is much darker and far more interesting than your little lies." Preston and Bianca were completely frozen in place, watching their perfect, wealthy world crumble piece by piece. The string quartet remained entirely silent in the background. The catering staff had stopped serving food, their trays hanging uselessly at their sides. Every single person in that sprawling, beautiful garden was holding their breath, waiting for the next massive bomb to drop. The Caldwell family had spent years burying me alive in their toxic shame, but they did not realize I was a seed, and now I was finally breaking through the soil to choke out everything they had built. I looked down at the faded pages of the ledger, running my thumb over my grandfather's neat handwriting. I took a deep breath, letting the silence of the garden stretch just a little bit longer. The anticipation was suffocating them. When I was 19 years old, I started speaking, my voice echoing clearly over the stunned crowd. I was enrolled in my second semester of college. I was on the dean's list. I had straight A grades, and I was sitting in the library studying for my midterms when the dean of admissions called me into his office. He told me that my tuition check had bounced and that my account was severely overdrawn. He told me I was being officially unenrolled immediately because of unpaid fees. I paused, looking up at Valerie, whose face had suddenly turned the color of ash. I was so confused I continued. My grandfather had set up a fully funded trust for my education before he died. There was supposed to be exactly $500,000 sitting in that account. It was legally mine, and it was untouchable until my 18th birthday. So I went to the bank panicking, thinking there had been some terrible administrative mistake. Valerie took a step backward, shaking her head slightly, her eyes wide with a very real terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "do not do this, Raven." But the time for mercy had expired over a decade ago. I turned my gaze to the wealthy guests, making sure they heard every single word of the Caldwell family reality. The bank manager pulled my records. I said, my voice growing stronger with every syllable, and he showed me the withdrawal slips. 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, someone had completely emptied the trust fund. Every single penny was gone, and the signature on the authorization forms belonged to me. Or rather, it was a very convincing forgery of my signature. The garden erupted into loud gasps. People were leaning over their tables staring at my parents in absolute disbelief. Forgery and theft of a trust fund were federal crimes, and the Atlanta elite did not take kindly to financial scandals, rubbing shoulders with them at a garden party. I looked directly at my father, Roland. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive suit clinging awkwardly to his large frame. He looked like a trapped animal searching desperately for an escape route that did not exist. "You forged my signature, father," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "You and mother went to the bank. You presented yourselves as my legal guardians managing my affairs, and you stole $500,000 from your own teenage daughter. You left me completely destitute and broke. And then when I came home crying for help, you packed my bags and threw me out onto the street. You told all your friends that I failed out because I was lazy and stupid. You used my heartbreak as a cover story to hide your own massive crime." Bianca stood frozen, staring at our parents with wide, horrified eyes. She might have been a cruel, spoiled brat, but even she did not know the depths of their financial depravity. "What is she talking about, Mom?" Bianca demanded, her voice trembling. "Tell everyone she is lying. Tell them you did not steal her money." But Valerie could not speak. She just stared at the ground, her chest heaving, her perfect aristocratic mask entirely shattered. I turned my attention to my younger sister. "Oh, Bianca," I said softly, shaking my head. "Do you really think you got into Stanford strictly on your own merit? Do you honestly believe your average high school test scores and your mediocre college essays secured you a spot at one of the most prestigious universities in the entire country?" Bianca recoiled as if I had physically struck her. Her face turned a bright, violent shade of red. "I worked hard for that acceptance," she screamed defensively, her voice cracking. "I am the smart one in this family." I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You did not work for anything, Bianca. Mom and Dad stole my inheritance and used it to make a massive anonymous cash donation to the Stanford Alumni Foundation just days before your acceptance letter miraculously arrived in the mail. They bought your admission, your entire academic career, your prestigious degree, your perfect golden child status. All of it was purchased with the money our grandfather left to me." The crowd started talking loudly now. The whispers turned into open, hostile judgment. The prominent society members who had just been clapping for Bianca were now looking at her with thinly veiled disgust. In their world, buying your way into an elite school was something you kept buried in absolute secrecy. Having it exposed at your own graduation party in front of hundreds of people was social suicide. Bianca looked down at her custom designer silk dress, and suddenly she looked incredibly small and utterly pathetic. Her entire identity had just been ripped away from her. Roland could not take it anymore. His pride was bleeding out all over the manicured lawn. He pointed a shaking, meaty finger at me, his face contorted with a violent, unhinged rage. "Shut your mouth, you lying, ungrateful witch!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You are completely insane. That book is a fake and you are just a bitter psycho trying to ruin your sister out of pure spite." He whipped his head around frantically, searching for the security guards who were standing near the catering tent trying to make themselves invisible. "Hey," Roland bellowed, waving his arms aggressively. "Grab her right now. Grab that crazy woman and throw her off my property. Get her out of my sight before I call the police and have her arrested for trespassing." The two large security guards exchanged nervous glances. They took a hesitant step forward toward my table, unsure if they should actually follow the orders of a man who had just been publicly accused of massive federal fraud. I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy leather ledger to my chest. I did not run, and I certainly did not back down. Elias Thorne simply adjusted his silk tie and stepped smoothly in front of me, blocking the path of the approaching guards. His cold, piercing gaze locked onto Roland, and the sheer authority radiating from the Wall Street lawyer made the two large security men stop dead in their tracks. "If you instruct your men to lay a hand on Miss Caldwell," Elias said, his voice echoing loudly in the sudden tense silence, "I will personally ensure that your next public appearance is in a federal courtroom wearing handcuffs. The forgery is just the beginning, Roland. You have no idea what is actually coming next." My father stood there hyperventilating, his entire world collapsing under the weight of his own lies. He was cornered, and he knew it, but his massive ego would not let him surrender. Little did he know the financial black hole he had dug for himself was far deeper than stolen trust funds and fake college admissions. The real devastation was still inside the red envelope, and I was finally ready to let it out. The security guards took another step forward despite Elias' warning. Roland was screaming at them, demanding they do their jobs and remove me from the property immediately. Elias did not even raise his voice or step back. He simply reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a solid leather credential case, holding a very specific federal identification card. He held it up so the guards could clearly see the official gold seal catching the bright afternoon sunlight. "Gentlemen," Elias said calmly, "I am not just corporate counsel. I am a former federal prosecutor and currently a sworn officer of the court, holding direct evidentiary documents of massive corporate fraud. If you so much as brush past my shoulder, the FBI agents stationed at the bottom of this hill will be up here in exactly 3 minutes, and you will both be listed as accomplices to federal financial crimes." The two large security guards immediately stopped walking. They looked at the gold seal, and then they looked at Roland, who was turning an alarming shade of dark purple. They slowly raised their hands in surrender and backed away, stepping entirely off the stone patio and disappearing into the crowd of terrified guests. They were not getting paid nearly enough to mess with the federal government or risk going to prison for a rich man throwing a tantrum. Roland stood there completely frozen. His chest heaved rapidly as he realized he had just lost his physical power over the situation. He could not bully me out of the garden. He could not silence me with threats. He was trapped in front of all his wealthy friends and business partners. I turned my back on my father, leaving him to suffocate in his own panic, and walked slowly toward the massive outdoor banquet table. The table was beautifully decorated with expensive silk tablecloths, towering crystal champagne glasses, and a lavish spread of gourmet food. It was a stunning monument to their fake wealth. I reached into my simple linen tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of papers. They were not letters or personal diaries. They were official, audited financial reports printed on heavy watermarked paper. I lifted the entire stack and threw it violently across the length of the banquet table. The heavy papers slapped against the crystal, knocking over several glasses of expensive champagne. The delicate glass shattered, sending bubbly liquid spilling across the silk linens. But nobody cared about the mess. Pages upon pages of dense financial data scattered across the silver platters of caviar and smoked salmon. The guests standing nearest to the table instinctively leaned in their eyes, scanning the bold red numbers printed on the top pages. Some of the men in the crowd were board members and primary investors in Caldwell Distribution. I could see the exact moment their hearts dropped into their stomachs as they read the truth. "You threw a beautiful party today, Father," I announced, my voice projecting clearly across the ruined banquet table. You stood up here in front of all these important people and bragged about giving your perfect golden child a $25 million estate and a massively successful logistics company. You wanted everyone to applaud your generosity and marvel at your incredible business acumen. But just like everything else in this family, it is all a pathetic, crumbling illusion. I pointed down at the scattered documents resting in the spilled champagne. Those are the real, unedited quarterly reports for Caldwell Distribution. The ones you have been desperately hiding from your own shareholders for the last 3 years. The numbers do not lie, Roland. Your warehouses are completely empty. Your transport trucks are breaking down, and your major shipping contracts expired months ago without being renewed. The company is not making a profit. It has not made a single dollar of actual profit since our grandfather died. You have been keeping it afloat by taking out illegal predatory loans and using the company assets as collateral to fund your lavish lifestyle. Roland grabbed the edge of the banquet table, his knuckles turning completely white. "Shut up!" he hissed, his voice barely a terrified whisper now. "Shut your mouth, Raven. You do not know what you are talking about. You are ruining everything we built." "I am not ruining anything, Roland," I replied coldly, staring right into his panicked eyes. "I am just reading the math. Caldwell Distribution is completely underwater. You are currently drowning in exactly $40 million of toxic, unpayable debt. The company is practically worthless. The estate is heavily mortgaged to the absolute limit. There is no massive inheritance waiting for your precious golden child today. There is only a giant financial black hole, and you are all standing right on the precipice of it." The crowd erupted into absolute chaos. Investors started shouting, pushing their way toward the banquet table to grab the scattered financial reports. Men in expensive suits snatched the wet papers off the silver plates, reading the devastating numbers for themselves. Angry voices demanded answers from Roland, calling him a fraud and a thief. The polite society garden party had officially turned into a hostile corporate crime scene. Valerie collapsed into a white patio chair, covering her face with her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her elite social standing evaporated into thin air forever. I watched the destruction of their empire with a deep, profound sense of peace. They had built a fortress of lies to keep me out, and now the walls were coming down on top of them. I turned slightly to look at my younger sister and her arrogant fiancé. Bianca was staring at the scattered papers, with her mouth hanging open, completely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. She was supposed to be handed the keys to a kingdom today, but instead she had just been handed a $40 million anchor. Preston, the smug finance bro who had just offered me a minimum wage job out of fake pity, was staring at the financial reports with wide, unblinking eyes. The realization was hitting him like a speeding freight train. He had spent years kissing up to my terrible parents, tolerating their arrogance and bullying me, all because he thought he was marrying into a massive Caldwell fortune. He thought he was securing a $25 million bag to save his own failing hedge fund. But now he realized the beautiful bride he was holding was not a wealthy heiress at all. She was just the spoiled, clueless daughter of a broke criminal. The look of pure, unadulterated panic washing over his pale face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The look of pure, unadulterated panic washing over Preston's pale face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I slowly turned away from him and shifted my focus back to my younger sister. Bianca was completely frozen, staring at the scattered financial documents soaking in the spilled champagne on the banquet table. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling uncontrollably. She looked up at me and then looked at our father, her blue eyes wide with a frantic, desperate confusion. "Did you really think they were just handing you a $25 million empire because they loved you so much, Bianca?" I asked, my voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy crowd. "Did you really think Father was just going to step down in the prime of his life and hand over the reins of Caldwell Distribution to a 26-year-old who just walked off a college campus with absolutely zero real-world business experience?" Bianca shook her head slowly, unable to form actual words. Her custom designer silk dress suddenly looked like a ridiculous costume on a frightened little girl playing pretend. I took a step closer to her, making sure she heard the absolute truth of her golden child existence. Father is not giving you a gift today, Bianca, I said softly. He is setting a massive trap. He is playing a desperate corporate shell game, and you are the ultimate pawn. If he remains the chief executive officer when the angry creditors finally file for bankruptcy, he will be personally investigated for corporate fraud. He will face severe federal charges for all the illegal loans and the embezzled funds he used to pay for this giant mansion and your luxury cars. I pointed at the wet papers on the table. But if he transfers the official ownership and the CEO title to you today, then you become the legal face of Caldwell Distribution. When the federal authorities come knocking with handcuffs next week, they will be looking for the current head of the company. They will be looking for you. Father was using your graduation party as a convenient excuse to legally dump $40 million of toxic criminal debt directly onto your shoulders so he could safely walk away clean. The wealthy investors and country club socialites gasped collectively. They looked at Roland with utter disgust. Throwing your own child under a federal bus to save yourself was a level of depravity that even the Atlanta elite could not stomach. Bianca's legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the hard stone patio, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She began to hyperventilate, gasping for air, as a full-blown panic attack seized her entire body. She looked at our mother, who was still hiding her face in her hands, refusing to make eye contact. Then she looked at Roland. "Tell me she is lying, Dad." Bianca choked out, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Tell me you are not going to let me go to federal prison for your mistakes. Please just tell me she's making all of this up." But Roland could not look his golden child in the eye. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his jaw clenched tight in absolute humiliation. His heavy silence was the loudest confession anyone in that garden could have ever heard. I did not stop there. I turned my attention back to Preston, who was currently backing away from Bianca, as if she were suddenly infected with a highly contagious disease. "And let us not forget the incredibly generous Preston Vance," I announced loudly. Father did not just need a naive new CEO to take the legal fall. He needed to buy more time with the angry creditors. He needed them to believe that Caldwell Distribution was about to receive a massive influx of secure institutional cash. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. "Father was using your engagement." "Preston?" I continued, my voice echoing across the silent lawn. "He was using your prestigious hedge fund as a fake financial shield. He paraded you around to the local banks, promising them that his brilliant new son-in-law was going to secure emergency funding to save the distribution company. He needed your signature on the marriage certificate so he could leverage your firm assets to cover his own illegal tracks. The sad irony is that he thought you were a wealthy savior while you were simultaneously praying that his fake $25 million estate would save your own failing fraudulent hedge fund. You were both actively trying to scam each other, and you were going to use Bianca as the sacrificial lamb to do it." Preston's face contorted into a mask of pure revulsion. He looked down at Bianca, who was still sobbing on the ground, struggling to breathe through her violent panic attack. He did not reach down to help her up. He did not offer her any comfort or reassurance. Instead, he took another large step backward, physically distancing himself from the toxic wreckage of the Caldwell family. "I cannot believe I wasted 2 entire years of my life on you people," Preston muttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and absolute disgust. "You are nothing but a bunch of ghetto scam artists wearing expensive clothes." Valerie head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a sudden desperate anger. "How dare you speak to us like that?" she screeched, her voice cracking wildly. "You are marrying into this family, Preston. You are supposed to protect her. Marry her." Preston laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the patio. "I am not marrying into a $40 million federal lawsuit, Valerie. I am completely done with this entire circus." Bianca let out a loud, agonizing wail. She reached a shaking hand up toward Preston, begging him not to abandon her in front of all her wealthy friends. But Preston just stared at her with cold, dead eyes. The fairy tale romance was entirely built on a foundation of mutual greed, and now that the money was gone, there was absolutely nothing left holding them together. The wealthy investors who had been reading the scattered financial reports finally started making their move. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair and a furious expression, threw his champagne glass onto the grass. "Roland, you absolute bastard!" the man yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "You looked me in the eye last week and swore our supply chains were secure. You used my grandchildren college funds to float your pathetic lifestyle. My lawyers will have a freeze on your personal accounts before the sun goes down today." Several other investors began shouting in agreement, pulling out their cell phones to call their own legal teams. The beautiful graduation party was completely dissolving into a chaotic, angry mob. Catering waiters slowly backed away from the tables, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. The string quartet had quietly packed up their expensive instruments and slipped out the back gates minutes ago. Roland tried to raise his hands to calm the angry investors, but his voice completely failed him. He was a man who had always relied on intimidation and fake wealth to command a room, but he had absolutely no leverage left. He was standing completely naked in front of his peers, stripped of all his false power. Bianca was still on her knees, crying so hard she was beginning to choke. Her perfect blonde hair was plastered to her wet face. "Mom, do something," she pleaded, looking at Valerie with desperate, terrified eyes. "Please, Mom, fix this. Do not let them take the house. Do not let Preston leave me." But Valerie had nothing to offer. For the first time in her life, my mother was completely silenced. She could not bully her way out of a $40 million deficit. She could not insult the federal investigators into going away. She sat frozen in her white patio chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal and spilled champagne, realizing that she would soon be trading her luxury country club memberships for a small, cramped apartment if she was lucky enough to avoid a prison sentence. I watched them all suffering in their own personal hells. It was a stunning masterpiece of karmic justice. They were finally experiencing the exact same helpless, terrifying isolation they had forced upon me when I was 19 years old. But unlike them, I had clawed my way out of the darkness with my own two hands. I had built an empire while they were busy building a house of cards, and now I was about to blow a massive hole right through the center of it. Preston did not just step away from Bianca. He looked at my entire family with a level of disgust that he had been hiding since the day he first stepped onto our property. The polite, sophisticated finance bro mask completely melted away, leaving behind the ugly, entitled racist man he truly was. He pointed a shaking finger at Roland, and then at my mother Valerie. "I should have known." Preston spat, his voice dripping with pure venom. "My friends warned me about getting involved with your kind. You dress up in expensive suits and buy big houses in white neighborhoods, but underneath it all, you are just a bunch of ghetto scam artists. You do not know how to build real wealth. You just steal and cheat to pretend you belong in our world." The racist slur hung heavily in the air. The few remaining guests who had not already fled to their cars gasped in shock. Valerie let out a loud, agonizing sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. She had spent her entire adult life trying to assimilate into elite high society, trying to distance herself from her roots and prove she was better than everyone else. She had worshipped Preston because his whiteness and his privileged background represented the ultimate status symbol for her golden child. And now that very same status symbol was standing on her stone patio, calling her ghetto in front of the Atlanta elite. Bianca reached out desperately, grabbing the sleeve of Preston's suit jacket. "Preston, please," she begged, her voice thick with panic and tears. "Do not do this to me. I love you. We can figure this out together. I did not know about the debt, I swear." Preston violently yanked his arm away, causing Bianca to stumble forward and scrape her bare knees against the hard stone patio. "Do not touch me, you pathetic little fraud," He sneered, looking down at her with absolute contempt. There is no we. The only reason I even proposed to you was because your father promised me a massive capital injection for my fund after the wedding. You are just a spoiled, useless girl with zero actual talent, and now that your family is completely broke, you are absolutely worthless to me. He held out his hand, palm facing up. Give me the ring back, Bianca. Right now. I am calling off this entire pathetic circus. Bianca clutched her left hand to her chest, shaking her head wildly. No, she sobbed, wiping her running mascara. Please, it is my graduation day. You cannot leave me like this. Take the fake ring off right now before I call the police and tell them your father is a federal criminal. Preston threatened, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. The sheer cruelty of his words broke whatever fragile illusion was left of my sister. Her perfect fairy tale was turning into a public nightmare. She fumbled with her shaking fingers, slowly pulling the massive diamond ring off her finger and dropping it into Preston's open palm. He did not even look at her again. He pocketed the ring and turned on his heel, ready to walk away and leave the Caldwell family to drown in their own $40 million mess. But Roland could not let that happen. His entire identity was deeply tied to this fake empire. The loss of the investors, the public exposure of his massive debt, and now the brutal rejection by the white son-in-law he so desperately idolized was simply too much for his massive ego to handle. Roland's face turned a terrifying shade of dark red, and the veins in his neck bulged visibly as he let out a desperate guttural scream that stopped Preston dead in his tracks. We are not bankrupt, Roland roared, his voice echoing violently across the empty lawn. Nobody is going to prison and nobody is leaving this family. The remaining investors stopped packing their briefcases. Elias Thorne stood perfectly still next to me, watching my father spiral into total delusion. Preston turned back around, a highly skeptical sneer forming on his face. You literally have $40 million in toxic debt. Roland Preston laughed mockingly, pointing at the banquet table. Your audited quarterly reports are sitting right there, soaking in cheap champagne. It is over. You are finished. It is not over. Roland screamed, marching toward Preston with a sudden renewed burst of frantic adrenaline. Those numbers are from last week. You do not know what happened this morning. You do not know the deal I just closed behind closed doors. Valerie looked up, her tear-streaked face suddenly showing a tiny glimmer of desperate hope. Roland? What are you talking about? She asked weakly, wiping her eyes. My father puffed out his chest, trying desperately to regain his posture as the powerful, untouchable patriarch. He looked around at the angry investors, at Preston, and finally directly at me. A manic, desperate smile spread across his sweaty face. Caldwell Distribution is being acquired, Roland announced, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. A formal offer was made just hours before this party started. Apex Logistics, the biggest transportation tech unicorn in the entire country, just offered to buy our company for $100 million in cold hard cash. The beautiful garden went completely dead silent again. $100 million was a staggering amount of money. It was more than enough to wipe out the $40 million debt, pay off all the angry creditors, and leave the Caldwell family with a massive fortune to easily maintain their lavish lifestyle. Preston's eyes widened, and the skeptical sneer on his face slowly began to fade. The greedy gears in his head started turning instantly. He looked at Roland, trying to figure out if this was just another desperate lie to save face or the ultimate financial bailout he had been waiting for. The wealthy investors exchanged confused glances, suddenly unsure if they should call their lawyers to sue or stick around to get a piece of the massive buyout money. Valerie stood up from her white patio chair, her sudden wave of relief washing away her tears and her shame. She walked over to Roland and grabbed his arm, looking at him like he was a conquering hero who had just saved their lives. Is it true, Roland? She asked, her voice breathless with sudden excitement. Apex Logistics is really buying us for $100 million. It is absolutely true. Roland bragged, glaring directly at me with a look of pure triumphant hatred. They sent the official acquisition paperwork this morning. So you see, Raven, your pathetic little attempt to destroy this family has completely failed. We are about to be richer than we have ever been, and you will still be nothing. Bianca slowly stood up from the ground, wiping the dirt from her bruised knees. She looked at Preston, waiting to see if the promise of $100 million would magically erase the horrible racist things he had just said to her. Preston swallowed hard, looking at the empty spot on Bianca's finger where the engagement ring used to be. His fake polite facade was slowly creeping back onto his face, driven entirely by his insatiable greed. They were all clinging to a ghost, and they had no idea I was the one holding the scythe. Preston did not take another step toward the exit. The heavy word million hung in the humid Atlanta air, like a massive golden anchor dragging him right back to the patio. He slowly turned his head to look at Roland, his eyes wide with a frantic, greedy calculation. $100 million, he repeated softly, his voice entirely stripped of the racist venom he had just spewed mere seconds ago. He looked down at the massive diamond ring sitting in his open palm, and then looked at Bianca, who was still kneeling on the cold stone. The transition was so incredibly fast, it would have given anyone else whiplash. But in the world of high finance and sociopathic greed, it was just another Tuesday for Preston Vance. He quickly slipped the ring back into his tailored pocket and knelt down beside my sister. "Bianca, baby," Preston whispered, reaching out to brush a stray lock of blonde hair out of her tear-stained face. "I am so sorry. I was just overwhelmed by the stress of those fake reports. You know how much pressure my fund is under. I did not mean any of those terrible things I said. I love you. We are a team, remember?" It was the most pathetic, hollow apology I had ever witnessed. But Bianca snatched it up like a starving dog grabbing a bone. She threw her arms around Preston's neck, burying her face in his shoulder, sobbing with pure relief. She did not care that he had just called her family a bunch of ghetto scam artists. She did not care that he had tried to abandon her when he thought she was broke. All that mattered to the golden child was that the handsome white finance bro was back by her side, validating her fragile existence. Valerie watched the reunion with a sickening smile of approval. The sheer panic that had melted her aristocratic mask was completely gone. She smoothed down the front of her expensive dress and stood up straight, tilting her chin up toward the sky. The arrogant matriarch of the Caldwell family had officially returned. She walked slowly toward my table, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. She stopped a few feet away from me, folding her arms across her chest, looking down at me with an expression of absolute triumph. "You really thought you had us," Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "You came here today with your stolen ledger and your little financial reports, hoping to embarrass us in front of our friends. You wanted to destroy your sister because you could never be her. But look at what actually happened, Raven." She gestured dramatically toward Roland, who was now happily fielding questions from the suddenly eager investors, assuring them that their money was safe and that the Apex Logistics buyout was a done deal. "Your father is a brilliant businessman," Valerie continued, her chest puffing out with unearned pride. "He engineered this entire situation perfectly, and Apex Logistics is going to pay us $100 million. Do you even comprehend how much money that is? We are going to be richer and more powerful than anyone else in our social circle. Bianca is going to be a millionaire before she even turns 27. She will have the perfect wedding, the perfect husband, and the perfect life." I just sat there resting my hands on the wobbly plastic table listening to her gloat. The sheer audacity of her delusion was almost impressive. "And what exactly do you get?" Raven Valerie asked, taking a step closer, leaning in so I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "You get absolutely nothing. You are still just a pathetic dropout sitting at a dirty corner table. You are not a part of this family anymore, and you will not see a single dime of that buyout money. We are going to celebrate tonight, and we are not even going to think about you. You will go back to your miserable, lonely life, and we will be flying first class to Paris." Roland walked over to join his wife, wrapping a heavy arm around her waist. He looked at Elias Thorne with a smug, dismissive grin. "You can pack up your little briefcase and take your client home now. lawyer Roland bragged loudly. "The Caldwell empire is completely secure. Whatever petty revenge she paid you to help her with has officially failed." I looked around the garden. The wealthy guests who had been ready to crucify my father just a few minutes ago were now murmuring with excitement. Greed was a powerful drug, and my father was currently the biggest dealer in Atlanta. They were all buying into the illusion of his power. They were ready to forget the forged trust fund and the $40 million of toxic debt simply because they thought a massive tech unicorn was about to drop a mountain of cash onto the estate. It was a beautiful, elaborate fantasy. They were building a brand new castle in the sky, entirely unaware that there was no foundation underneath it. I looked up at my mother, who was still smirking down at me, waiting for me to break. She wanted me to scream and cry. She wanted me to throw a childish tantrum because I was being left out of the massive payday. She wanted to see the crushing disappointment on my face. Instead, I simply smiled. It was not a forced smile or a defensive smirk. It was a genuine warm smile of complete serenity. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. $100 million is a staggering amount of money. It changes lives. It shifts the entire balance of power. And you are also right about Bianca. She is going to need every single bit of support she can get from Preston, because the reality of that buyout is going to be incredibly difficult for her to process. Valerie frowned, her arrogant smirk faltering just a tiny bit at my calm reaction. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. Roland tightened his grip on Valerie's waist, glaring at me. "She is just talking in circles to make herself feel better," he muttered. "Do not listen to her, Valerie. She is completely delusional." But Roland was the one sweating again. Despite his loud bragging and his sudden burst of confidence, he was still a desperate man backed into a corner. He knew that the Apex Logistics offer was real, but he also knew that closing a $100 million acquisition required a massive amount of legal compliance and total family cooperation. The $40 million of debt was still a ticking time bomb, and he needed the Apex money to defuse it before the federal investigators caught wind of his fraud. He thought he held all the cards. He thought he had successfully manipulated the entire narrative back in his favor. The illusion of power was wrapped tightly around the Caldwell family, shielding them from the harsh reality of their own actions. But an illusion only works as long as the audience believes the magic trick. And I was about to step onto the stage and reveal exactly how the trick was done. Before I could say another word, Roland reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded document printed on heavy legal paper. He marched over to my wobbly plastic table with heavy, aggressive steps. His face was flushed red with a mixture of anger and desperate anticipation. He slammed the document down on the table right next to my plastic cup of water. The loud smack echoed sharply, causing a few nearby guests to jump in surprise. "Sign it," Roland demanded, his voice thick with a fake commanding authority. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top clearly read "Comprehensive Waiver of Property and Estate Rights." It was a legally binding contract designed to strip me of any and all claims to the Caldwell family assets, including the $25 million mansion and any residual equity in the logistics company. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Roland leaned over the table, resting his heavy hands on the plastic surface. "Do not play dumb with me, Raven," he sneered. "You know exactly what this is. Apex Logistics is a massive corporate entity, and their legal team is incredibly thorough. They are buying out our entire operation for $100 million, but before they transfer the funds, they require an absolute clean title on all Caldwell properties. That means they need 100% of the family members to sign off on the asset transfer. They need a legal guarantee that no disgruntled relatives are going to come crawling out of the woodwork to sue them later." He tapped his thick finger aggressively against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "You are technically still listed as a living heir on some of the older estate documents," he explained, his jaw clenching with irritation. "The lawyers need your signature to clear the bureaucratic red tape. It is just a simple formality. You sign the paper right now, relinquishing any theoretical rights you might think you have to this estate, and the buyout goes through smoothly. I let out a soft breath, tracing my eyes over the dense legal jargon printed on the page. So you are telling me that your massive $100 million payday is currently completely stalled because you need my signature? I asked, looking back up into his sweaty, desperate face. Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh from a few feet away. Do not flatter yourself, Raven, she spat, crossing her arms over her chest. You are not holding up anything. Your father is just doing diligent corporate housekeeping. You have absolutely no real legal claim to anything we own anyway. We just want to make sure you do not try to drag us into court later out of pure jealousy when you see Bianca living her perfect millionaire lifestyle. Roland pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and tossed it onto the document. It rolled slightly before coming to a stop near my hand. I am a very generous man, Roland declared loudly, ensuring the investors and country club guests were listening to his display of supposed charity. Despite everything you have done today, despite you trying to ruin your sister, beautiful graduation party with your pathetic lies, I am still willing to help you out. He puffed out his chest, looking around the garden to soak in the attention of his peers. If you pick up that pen and sign the waiver right now, I will personally write you a check for $10,000, he announced. You can take that money and go back to whatever sad little apartment you live in. $10,000 is probably more money than you have seen in your entire life. It will pay your rent for a few months and keep you off the streets. Think of it as a final parting gift from the family you betrayed. The sheer insult of the offer was almost poetic. $10,000 to disappear forever so he could walk away with $100 million. He truly believed I was nothing more than a desperate broke loser who would jump at the chance to grab a few breadcrumbs falling off his lavish table. He thought $10,000 was my exact price tag. I looked at the silver pen sitting on the document. Preston and Bianca had walked over to join my parents, forming a united wall of arrogance and entitlement. Preston was back to looking at me with that familiar, condescending pity. You really should take the deal, Raven, Preston advised, his voice dripping with fake concern. $10,000 is a very solid safety net for someone in your precarious financial situation. You do not want to be stubborn and end up walking away with absolutely nothing. Just sign the paper and let the adults handle the real business. Bianca nodded enthusiastically, leaning against Preston's arm. Yeah, Raven, just take the money and leave, she chimed in, her voice returning to its usual whiny pitch. You have caused enough drama for one day. You are just embarrassing yourself now. Nobody here believes your stupid lies about trust funds and fake debts anyway. Dad just proved he is worth $100 million, so you should just take your little allowance and go home. They stood there staring down at me, waiting for me to surrender. They had spent my entire life breaking my spirit, forcing me to accept whatever tiny scraps of affection or attention they were willing to throw my way. They were so accustomed to my compliance that they literally could not fathom a world where I held the ultimate power over their future. Elias Thorne took a half-step forward, ready to intervene and tear the insulting waiver to shreds. But I held up my hand to stop him. I wanted to savor this specific moment. I wanted to stretch it out and let them revel in their fake victory just a little bit longer. I reached out and picked up the silver pen. It felt heavy and cold in my hand. Roland let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. His tense shoulders dropped and a massive, triumphant grin spread across his face. Valerie smirked, turning her head to share a victorious look with Bianca and Preston. They thought they had won. They thought the threat was officially neutralized and their fake empire was secure. Make sure you sign your full legal name, Roland instructed eagerly, pointing at the dotted line. No scribbles, Raven. The Apex lawyers are very strict about clear signatures. I held the pen over the paper, letting the tip hover just a millimeter above the signature line. I looked at the comprehensive waiver, reading the words that would legally erase me from the Caldwell family history. It was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me erased. They wanted to take my inheritance, buy their way into elite society, and leave me to rot in the shadows. Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Father, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a lethal weight. Are you sure you want me to sign away my rights to this estate? Roland laughed, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed across the stone patio. Of course I am sure, he mocked. It is the only way you will ever see a single dime from me. Sign the paper. Take your $10,000 and get off my property before I change my mind and have you thrown out for free. I kept the pen hovering over the paper. I looked up into his eyes, and for a brief second, I saw the absolute terror hiding just behind his arrogant smile. He needed this signature, like he needed oxygen. The Apex Logistics buyout was his only lifeline, and he was completely desperate to grab it. But what my father did not understand was that the lifeline he was so desperately reaching for was actually a noose, and I was the one holding the rope. Preston stepped closer to the wobbly plastic table, leaning over me with his arms crossed and his chest puffed out. He completely forgot that just 5 minutes ago, he was terrified of federal investigators and trying to flee the property. The mere mention of $100 million buyout had magically restored his arrogant finance bro persona. Listen to your father, Raven, he said, his voice dripping with that unbearable condescension he always used when speaking to me. In the real business world, when a massive acquisition of this magnitude is on the table, you do not want to be the one holding up the deal. Apex Logistics is not going to wait around for a stubborn family outcast to throw a petty emotional tantrum. They will pull their $100 million offer, and then you will be held legally responsible for ruining everything. Just be smart for once in your miserable life. Take the $10,000 and sign the paper. You are completely out of your depth here. This is high-level corporate finance, and you are just a clueless college dropout. Bianca stepped up right next to him, nodding in aggressive agreement. She had completely forgotten about her tears and her scraped knees and her ruined silk dress. The promise of $100 million had instantly revived her vicious, entitled spirit. God, you are always so incredibly difficult, Raven, she complained, rolling her perfectly painted eyes dramatically. You always have to make everything about you. Just sign the stupid paper. You are acting like a total loser right now. Everyone is staring at you, and everyone is laughing at you, just like they always do. She leaned forward, placing her hands on her hips, glaring at me with pure hatred. You are not smart enough to hold this up, Bianca spat. You do not even know what half the legal words on that contract mean. You probably cannot even read the paragraphs without sounding them out. You have always been the stupid one in this family, and now you are just trying to drag me down, because you know you will never have a fraction of the success I do. Just take your little pity check and go back to your pathetic empty life, so we can finally celebrate my big day. Valerie let out another sharp laugh, moving to stand right behind Roland. She draped her arm over his shoulder, looking down at me as if I were a disgusting bug on the bottom of her shoe. She is just stalling because she wants attention. Valerie mocked, her voice loud enough for the remaining wealthy guests to hear clearly. She has always been exactly like this. She was a stupid child, and she is a stupid adult. She cannot stand the fact that you are about to be a millionaire, Bianca. She is absolutely suffocating on her own bitter jealousy. Sign the damn paper, Raven! Roland barked suddenly, slamming his heavy hand down on the edge of my table. The cheap plastic cracked loudly under the weight of his fist, causing my cup of ice water to spill over the edges. I am entirely out of patience. I am offering you a massive handout because I am a good, generous man. But if you do not put ink on that dotted line right now, I will have my security guards drag you out of here by your hair, and you will leave with absolutely zero. You will walk away with nothing, and I will make sure my lawyers bury you in so much litigation you will be paying legal fees for the rest of your miserable life. I sat there completely surrounded by their hostility. The sheer weight of their collective hatred was pressing down on me exactly the way it had when I was a teenager living in that suffocating house. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they had successfully broken me down through sheer intimidation, verbal abuse, and the threat of total isolation. They believed that if they yelled loud enough and insulted me aggressively enough, I would eventually crumble just like I always did when I was younger. I slowly lowered my hand toward the heavy legal document resting on the wet plastic table. I gripped the expensive silver pen tightly in my fingers and let my hand tremble just slightly. I made my knuckles shake as the tip of the pen hovered right over the signature line. I let them see the hesitation. I let them believe I was terrified and broken. I lowered my head slightly, hiding my eyes, letting them think I was finally submitting to their absolute authority. Valerie saw my shaking hand and let out a loud, triumphant laugh. "There we go," Valerie gloated, her voice echoing across the silent patio, bouncing off the walls of the massive estate. The dumb one finally realizes she has no other choice. "Good girl, Raven. Do what you are told for once in your life and sign the paper." Roland grinned widely, his chest puffing out with absolute victory. The heavy sweat on his forehead seemed to dry up as he watched the pen hovering over the contract. Preston smirked and adjusted his silk tie, clearly proud of his own persuasive skills, believing his corporate intimidation had pushed me over the edge. Bianca practically vibrated with excitement. A cruel, victorious smile plastered across her face as she got ready to claim her newly acquired wealth and step into her millionaire lifestyle. They were entirely consumed by their own greed and their own boundless arrogance. They were so focused on the finish line that they did not realize the track they were running on was about to completely collapse. I stared at the blank signature line for a few more seconds. I listened to the sound of Valerie's triumphant laughter ringing in my ears. I listened to the heavy breathing of my father standing over me like a dictator. And then I stopped shaking. The fake fear completely vanished from my body, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming calm that radiated through my veins like ice water. I did not press the ink onto the paper. I did not sign away my rights. Instead, I simply opened my fingers. The heavy silver pen slipped from my grasp and dropped onto the plastic table with a loud, sharp clatter. The noise cut through Valerie's laughter, instantly silencing her. Roland's smile immediately fell from his face, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. Preston and Bianca stared at the pen as it rolled across the table, slipped off the edge, and fell onto the stone floor with a final metallic ping. I sat back in my wobbly plastic chair, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and looked directly into my father's panicked eyes. "I am not signing it," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold enough to freeze the entire garden. The absolute silence that followed my words was heavy and suffocating. Roland stared at the silver pen lying on the stone patio, and then his eyes slowly dragged up to meet mine. The reality of my refusal hit him like a physical blow. The smug, arrogant smile melted off his face, completely replaced by a twisted mask of pure, unhinged desperation. His $100 million fantasy was crumbling in front of him, and he simply could not process the fact that the daughter he had abused her entire life was the one pulling the trigger. He let out a guttural roar of absolute rage. The sound tore from his throat, echoing across the manicured lawn. He did not look like a sophisticated businessman anymore. He looked like a wild, cornered animal. He lunged forward, throwing his massive body weight across the wobbly plastic table, trying to grab my neck with his thick, sweaty hands. The cheap plastic table buckled and snapped completely under his weight, sending my cup of ice water crashing to the ground. Valerie shrieked, taking a step back as her husband completely lost his mind in front of the Atlanta elite. Bianca covered her mouth, gasping in horror as Roland desperately clawed the air, trying to reach me. I did not even flinch. I knew I was perfectly safe. Before Roland, heavy hands could even come close to my skin. Elias Thorne moved with a terrifying precision. The high-powered Wall Street lawyer stepped smoothly into the chaos. He grabbed Roland by the collar of his expensive custom suit and effortlessly redirected the older man forward momentum. Elias twisted his grip and shoved Roland backward with a sudden, brutal force. My father stumbled clumsily over the broken pieces of the plastic table, crashing hard onto the stone patio. He landed heavily on his back, gasping for air, his chest heaving as the wind was completely knocked out of his lungs. Preston instinctively took a step back, his eyes wide with fear, completely unwilling to help the man he had just been praising minutes ago. Elias stood tall over Roland, straightening his pristine charcoal suit jacket without breaking a single sweat. He looked down at my father with a gaze so cold it could have frozen a raging fire. Elias slowly reached down and picked up the comprehensive property waiver that had fluttered to the ground during the brief physical struggle. He held the thick legal document up in the air so everyone in the garden could see it clearly. This document is a complete insult to the legal profession, Roland Elias said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. You cannot force someone to sign away an estate you do not even legally own. Elias gripped the top of the heavy paper and pulled his hands apart, tearing the waiver clean down the middle. The ripping sound was incredibly loud in the quiet garden. He stacked the two halves together and tore them again and again until the coercive contract was nothing more than a handful of useless white confetti. He opened his hands and let the shredded pieces flutter down onto Roland's sweaty face. Roland stared up at the falling pieces of paper, completely paralyzed by humiliation and shock. Valerie rushed to his side, dropping to her knees on the hard stone, desperately trying to help him sit up. "What are you doing?" she cried, looking up at Elias with pure hatred. "You cannot treat us like this. We are the Caldwells. We are about to close $100 million deal with Apex Logistics, and when we do, we will use every penny to destroy you and your fake client." Elias did not even acknowledge her hysterical threats. He turned his back on my parents and faced me once again. He reached inside his premium leather briefcase for the second time today. He pulled out the thick parchment envelope, the one heavily sealed with bright red wax that he had brought with him when he first walked through the gates. The entire garden seemed to lean in collectively. The wealthy investors, the angry creditors, Preston, Bianca. Everyone was watching that envelope. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Elias reached into his inner pocket and produced a sleek silver letter opener. He held the red wax envelope flat in his left hand and carefully slid the sharp edge of the letter opener under the flap. He sliced through the thick red wax with a slow, deliberate motion. The breaking of the seal made a sharp cracking noise that echoed perfectly across the patio. He reached his long fingers inside the envelope and pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents. These papers were not printed on cheap office stationery. They were bound with premium legal covers bearing the official embossed seal of Apex Logistics. Resting right on top of the thick legal packet was a crisp, rectangular slip of paper. It was a certified cashier check. Elias did not hand the papers to Roland. He did not look at Valerie or Bianca. He turned completely toward me and respectfully placed the massive acquisition contract and the certified check directly into my hands. My family watched the exchange with utter confusion. They could not understand why the lawyer was giving the Apex documents to the family outcast. Roland struggled to his feet, wiping the shredded pieces of his fake waiver off his expensive suit. His face was twisted in pain and desperate, furious confusion. "What is going on?" Roland demanded, his voice trembling as he pointed a shaking finger at the documents in my hands. "Why does she have the paperwork?" "Give that to me right now, Raven. Those are my documents. That is my $100 million deal. You have absolutely no right to touch my company acquisition." I looked down at the certified check resting on top of the acquisition agreement. The numbers printed on the paper were absolutely stunning. One followed by 8 zeros. Exactly $100 million. It was the exact amount Roland needed to save himself from federal prison and absolute financial ruin. It was the exact amount Bianca needed to keep her handsome racist fiancé from walking out the door forever. It was the exact amount Valerie needed to maintain her snobby country club memberships and her pathetic illusion of superiority. They were all staring at that piece of paper like it was the Holy Grail. They were practically drooling over the promise of salvation. They had completely misread the entire situation from the very beginning. They thought the check was a gift from a mysterious tech giant coming to rescue their falling empire. They were about to learn that the tech giant was not a stranger at all. I held the crisp piece of paper between my fingers, letting the warm Georgia breeze flutter the edges slightly. Roland was breathing so heavily I could hear the air rattling in his chest. His eyes were completely glued to the certified check. He looked exactly like a starving man staring at a massive feast. Valerie was standing right behind him, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her chest, her eyes wide and overflowing with greedy anticipation. Even Bianca had stopped crying, completely hypnotized by the sheer amount of wealth resting in my hands. "Give it to me," Raven Roland demanded, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of anger and desperate need. "That belongs to me. That is the Apex Logistics buyout money. You have absolutely no right to hold my property. Hand it over right now." I did not hand it over. I slowly turned the check around so the front of the financial document was facing him. I held it up at eye level, forcing him to look at it. Roland took a frantic step forward, his eyes scanning the beautiful printed numbers. One followed by 8 zeros. Exactly $100 million. He let out a shaky breath of profound relief, a massive, triumphant smile spreading across his sweaty face. He reached out his thick, greedy fingers to snatch the paper from my grasp. I smoothly pulled my hand back just out of his reach. Elias Thorne took a subtle step forward, reminding Roland without saying a single word that any physical aggression would result in immediate federal intervention. Roland stopped, his hands hovering awkwardly in the empty air. "You are so intensely focused on the numbers, Father," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent patio. "You are so blinded by your own greed and your desperate need to save your fake empire that you did not even bother to read the rest of the document." Roland frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" He snapped, his tone defensive. "It is a certified cashier check. It is the massive payday they promised me." "Look closer," I instructed, holding the check perfectly steady. "Read the payee line." "Roland, read exactly who this $100 million is being paid to." Roland leaned forward, squinting his eyes to read the fine print on the bank document. The silence in the garden was absolute and terrifying. You could hear the melting ice clinking in the spilled cups on the stone floor. I watched his eyes scan the printed text. I watched the exact second the devastating reality crashed into his brain. The massive, triumphant smile completely vanished from his face, as if it had been violently wiped away. His mouth fell open, and a strange, pathetic choking sound escaped his throat. "What is it?" Valerie asked, her voice pitched high with a sudden rising panic. "Roland, what does it say? Take the check from her right now and let us go inside." Roland could not move. His arms fell limply to his sides. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, as if I had just transformed into a terrifying monster right in front of him. All the color drained from his skin, leaving him looking incredibly old and incredibly sick. "It is not made out to you." "Is it, Father?" I asked, my tone entirely devoid of pity or hesitation. "This check is not payable to Roland Caldwell. It is not payable to Caldwell Distribution. And it is certainly not a massive golden parachute for you to take and fly first class to Paris with your arrogant wife." I turned the check slightly so the wealthy investors and country club guests standing nearby could clearly see the printed text. "This check is made out directly to the Federal Bankruptcy Court of Atlanta and the primary creditors of Caldwell Distribution." I announced, my voice projecting powerfully over the stunned crowd. Valerie let out a confused gasp, stepping forward and clutching Roland's arm. "What does that mean?" she demanded, looking frantically between me and Elias Thorne. "Why would Apex pay the creditors directly? The money is supposed to go to us. We are the owners of the company. We are the ones selling it. You really do not understand how corporate acquisitions work, do you, Mother?" I replied, shaking my head slowly at her utter ignorance. "Apex Logistics is not buying your failing company to make you rich. They are executing a brutal, hostile takeover. They are purchasing your $40 million of toxic debt directly from the banks. They are buying the underwater mortgages on this $25 million estate. They are buying the heavy liens on your empty warehouses and your broken shipping trucks." I placed the certified check carefully on top of the thick legal acquisition agreement in my left hand. "Apex is not handing you $100 million to save your lavish lifestyle," I explained. watching the realization slowly sink into Valerie's mind. Apex is paying $100 million to buy the Caldwell family. They own your debt now. They own this mansion. They own the very ground you are standing on. And according to the legal stipulations in this agreement, they are immediately foreclosing on every single asset you possess. The crowd erupted into shocked, terrified whispers. The wealthy investors who were just threatening to sue Roland were now staring at the documents in my hands with a mixture of profound awe and deep fear. They realized that the arrogant Caldwell empire had just been completely swallowed whole by a massive corporate predator. The people who had mocked me and excluded me were now witnessing my absolute domination over the family that cast me out. Bianca began to cry again, fresh tears ruining her expensive makeup. "Dad, do something," she whined, stamping her foot childishly on the patio. "Tell them they cannot take the house. Where are we going to live? I cannot be homeless on my graduation day." Roland was shaking his head violently, his entire large body trembling. "No," he muttered, his voice completely broken and hollow. "No, this is absolutely impossible. The Apex representatives told me this was a clean, friendly buyout. They promised me a seamless transition of wealth. They would not just buy the debt to liquidate us. Why would a massive technology unicorn want to destroy a local distribution company? It does not make any logical business sense." He looked at the thick legal documents in my hands, and then his eyes drifted down to the signature line at the very bottom of the acquisition agreement. His eyes widened until they looked like they were about to pop out of his skull. He stumbled backward, pointing a violently trembling finger at the paperwork. "Whose name is on that contract?" Roland demanded, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Whose name is signed at the bottom of that Apex acquisition agreement, Raven?" Preston stepped forward, his dormant finance bro instincts finally kicking in. He pushed roughly past Valerie and leaned over to look closely at the paperwork I was holding. He scanned the bold legal text at the bottom of the page. The name of the purchasing executive, the authorized signatory for Apex Logistics, was printed clearly in thick black ink. Preston's eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked from the paper to my face, and then back to the paper as if his brain was short-circuiting. "This cannot be real," Preston whispered, his face turning entirely pale, his arrogant demeanor completely shattered. "This has to be some kind of massive legal forgery." "What does it say?" Valerie screamed, completely losing the last shred of her aristocratic dignity. "Who bought the company, Preston? Tell me right now before I lose my mind." Preston slowly backed away from the documents, looking at me as if he were standing in the presence of a god. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking uncontrollably at his sides. "It is her," Preston said, his voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd, but echoing like thunder in the ears of my family. "The purchasing executive, the sole authorized signatory for Apex Logistics, is Raven Caldwell." Valerie's jaw dropped wide open. She stared at me, her eyes darting frantically across my face, searching for any sign of a joke or a trick. Roland let out another strange choking noise, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. Bianca simply stopped crying, her brain completely unable to process the impossible words Preston had just spoken. I stood there holding the documents that officially transferred their entire legacy, their home, and their future, directly into my hands. The bright red wax from the envelope was still clinging to the edges of the thick paper. The grand illusion of the Caldwell family was completely shattered, broken into a million unfixable pieces. They were no longer wealthy elites. They were completely broke, and their ultimate fate was being held by the daughter they had thrown away like trash 13 years ago. I watched them struggle to comprehend the reality of their situation. Roland was staring at my name, printed on the legal documents, like it was a death sentence. Valerie was shaking her head back and forth, unable to process the absolute destruction of her perfect world. "You spent my entire life calling me the dumb one," I said, my voice calm but echoing with absolute authority across the silent garden. "You told everyone I failed out of college because I was too lazy and too stupid to succeed. You kicked me out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a forged signature on my empty trust fund. You never once bothered to look for me. You never once asked how I was surviving. If you had bothered to check, you would have realized that I did not spend the last 13 years crying in a cheap apartment. The reason I did not go back to college is because I was far too busy building an empire from the ground up. I took a step closer to the broken plastic table, looking directly down into Roland's terrified eyes. I am not just a purchasing executive for Apex Logistics, father. I built Apex Logistics. I wrote the original code for our supply chain software in a tiny public library while I was living out of my used car. I pitched the algorithms to venture capitalists while you were busy buying luxury cars with embezzled money. I worked 18-hour days for years while you pampered your golden child and laughed at my supposed failure. I am the sole founder and the chief executive officer of the very tech unicorn you were just bragging about to your wealthy friends. Bianca let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. Preston looked like he was about to vomit, his finance bro brain completely short-circuiting at the realization that the woman he had just offered a minimum wage job to was actually a tech billionaire. Roland's legs finally gave out completely. He dropped heavily onto his knees on the hard stone patio, the sharp impact echoing loudly across the silent lawn. I hid my identity behind corporate shell companies and legal proxies during the entire negotiation process, I explained, watching Roland face twist in agony as he realized how thoroughly he had been played. You thought you were dealing with a faceless board of directors who wanted to buy your amazing business. You thought you had outsmarted the market. But it was just me, Roland, the dumb one. I was sitting on the other side of every single conference call listening to you beg for a buyout to save your miserable life. I listened to you lie about your financial projections while I already held your actual audited reports in my hands. You see? I continued walking slowly around the scattered pieces of the plastic table, holding the heavy legal documents in my hands. I did not offer you $100 million to buy your equity. Your equity is absolutely worthless. I used my company capital to buy your $40 million of toxic debt directly from your desperate creditors. The banks were absolutely thrilled to offload your garbage loans. I bought the heavy mortgages on this $25 million estate. I bought the liens on every single warehouse and delivery truck Caldwell Distribution supposedly owns. I stopped pacing and stood tall over my kneeling father. You thought this check was a golden ticket to save your lavish lifestyle, but it was actually the purchase price of your absolute ruin. I own the debt now. And since you are currently in massive default on every single one of those loans, I am officially foreclosing on all of it. Effective immediately. This entire estate belongs to Apex Logistics now, which means it belongs to me. Valerie fell to her knees right next to Roland, her expensive designer dress pooling on the dirty patio, soaking up the spilled ice water. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my simple linen dress. "No, Raven," she sobbed, her voice completely broken, stripped of all its former arrogance. "You cannot do this to us. This is our home. We are your family. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. Please, sweetheart, we can fix this. We can be a real family now that you are so successful." The sheer audacity of her fake affection made my blood run cold. "You lost the right to call yourselves my family the day you stole my grandfather money to buy a fake degree for your golden child," I replied coldly, taking a deliberate step back so her greedy fingers could not touch me. "You built this beautiful house on a foundation of lies and theft. You paraded around Atlanta pretending to be untouchable elites while you actively bankrupted the company my grandfather worked his entire life to build. You stole my future to fund your vanity, and now I am taking everything back." Roland looked up at me, tears streaming down his sweaty face. He was completely shattered, a hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch he used to be. "Raven, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just let us keep the house. Let me keep my title at the company. I will work for you. I will be your subordinate. Just please do not humiliate me in front of all these people." I looked around at the crowd of wealthy investors and country club socialites. They were completely silent, watching the mighty Caldwell family beg for mercy on their hands and knees. The men in expensive suits who had been ready to sue Roland were now looking at me with a profound mixture of fear and absolute respect. They knew they were witnessing the birth of a new titan in the corporate world. "You humiliated yourself, Roland," I said softly, staring down at the broken man on the patio. "You dug this massive hole with your own greed and your own arrogance. I'm just handing you the shovel so you can bury yourself." Preston slowly backed away from the family, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. The realization that the Caldwells were not just broke, but actively being evicted by a billionaire sister was simply too much for his greedy mind to handle. He did not say another word. He just turned around and practically sprinted across the lawn, desperate to distance himself from the toxic wreckage before his own failing hedge fund was somehow dragged into the mess. Bianca watched him run away, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. "Preston!" she screamed, her voice cracking horribly. "Preston, come back!" But he did not even turn his head. The handsome white savior had completely abandoned the golden child the exact second the money disappeared. I turned my back on my sobbing sister and faced my parents, who were still kneeling on the cold stone. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property," I announced, my voice projecting clearly over the stunned crowd of guests. The security guards who were standing nervously by the gates suddenly straightened their posture. They looked at the legal documents in my hands and quickly realized exactly who signed their paychecks now. They stepped forward, marching across the patio, ready to enforce the eviction of the former owners. The party was officially over. The Caldwell Empire was dead, and I was finally free. The security guards who had once been paid to keep me out of this massive estate were now standing at attention, waiting for my next command. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of 30 minutes. Roland was still on his knees, his expensive tailored trousers soaking up the muddy water from the spilled ice cups. He looked up at me, his chest heaving with desperate broken sobs. "Raven, please!" he cried, reaching out with trembling hands. "You cannot do this. I built this company. I built this life for us. I am your father. You cannot just take everything away from me. I will be completely ruined." "You ruined yourself, Roland," I replied, my voice echoing with a cold, calculated finality. "You built this life on a mountain of fraud and stolen money. You used my inheritance to buy your way into elite society, and you left me with absolutely nothing. You thought you were a brilliant businessman, but you were just a pathetic con artist playing with money that never belonged to you." Valerie scrambled forward across the wet stone patio, her expensive silk dress completely ruined. She ignored Roland entirely and focused all her desperate energy on me. She threw herself forward, grabbing my arm with both hands. Her perfect aristocratic mask was entirely gone, replaced by a hysterical, terrifying desperation. "Raven, my sweet, beautiful girl," Valerie sobbed, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "You know I always loved you. You know I always knew you were special. We were just tough on you because we wanted you to reach your full potential. We wanted you to be strong. Look at you now. You are a billionaire. You are the most successful woman in Atlanta. We are so incredibly proud of you." She tightened her grip on my arm, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "We are a family. Raven," she cried, her voice cracking with fake emotion. "Family forgives each other. Family sticks together no matter what. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street. Please, sweetheart, let us just go inside and talk about this. We can be a real family now. We can share this amazing success together." The sheer audacity of her words made me feel physically sick. She had spent my entire life breaking my spirit, tearing me down and calling me a stupid, worthless failure. She had literally just told me to take a $10,000 bribe and disappear forever so she could fly first class to Paris with her golden child. And now that the tables were completely turned, she was suddenly crying tears of motherly love and demanding forgiveness. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of daughterly affection. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow disgust. I violently yanked my arm away from her grasp, causing her to stumble forward and scrape her hands against the hard stone patio. "Do not ever touch me again, Valerie," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried across the silent garden. "Do not ever call me your sweet girl. You lost the right to call yourself my mother 13 years ago when you forged my signature and stole my future." Valerie gasped, clutching her scraped hands to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. "Raven, please," she whimpered. I stepped back, looking down at both of them with absolute contempt. Family does not steal $500,000 from their teenage daughter to feed their own pathetic vanity, I said loudly, making sure every single person on the lawn heard the brutal truth. Family does not kick their child out onto the street and lie to all their friends about it. Family does not offer a minimum wage job as a sick joke while planning to dump $40 million of federal debt onto their other daughter. You are not my family. You are just the people who happen to share my DNA. Roland buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly, his massive shoulders shaking with defeat. Valerie remained on the ground, staring at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They had finally realized that their words had absolutely no power over me anymore. They could not bully me, they could not manipulate me, and they certainly could not guilt-trip me into saving them from the consequences of their own actions. Bianca was standing a few feet away, completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of her entire universe. The perfect golden child had lost everything in the blink of an eye. Her prestigious degree was paid for with stolen money. Her handsome, wealthy fiancé had abandoned her the second he realized she was broke. And the massive $25 million estate she thought she was inheriting actually belonged to the sister she had spent her entire life tormenting. She looked at me, her blue eyes wide and completely empty. She did not beg. She did not scream. She just stood there, looking like a hollow porcelain doll that had been dropped on the floor and shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I turned my attention back to the security guards who were waiting patiently for my orders. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice clear and authoritative, "you are now employed by Apex Logistics. Your first official duty is to escort these 3 individuals off my property. They are no longer welcome here. If they attempt to take any assets from the house, call the police immediately." The guards nodded firmly, stepping forward to grab Roland by the arms and haul him to his feet. Valerie scrambled backward, crying hysterically as another guard grabbed her elbow and pulled her up from the wet patio. The arrogant Caldwell empire had officially crumbled to dust, and I was the one holding the broom. Elias Thorne did not waste another second. He reached into his perfectly tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. His thumb swiped across the screen, and he held the device to his ear. The garden was so incredibly quiet that everyone could hear the faint ringing on the other end of the line. "Yes, this is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I am at the Caldwell estate in Atlanta. I need a federal white-collar crime unit dispatched immediately. I have direct physical evidence of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the forgery of a major trust fund. The primary suspect is Roland Caldwell, and he is currently being detained on the premises." Roland let out a pathetic whimpering sound when he heard the word federal. The remaining color in his face drained entirely. He looked like a deflated balloon, a man who had spent his entire life inflating his own ego, only to have it popped in front of the entire world. His large hands trembled violently at his sides, and he stared blankly at the ruined plastic table, unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of his life. Valerie tried to crawl toward Elias, her expensive ruined dress dragging heavily against the wet stone patio. "You cannot call the police," she shrieked, her voice hoarse and broken. "We are good people. We go to church. We are prominent members of this community. You cannot send my husband to jail over a stupid family misunderstanding." Elias ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Stealing $500,000 from your own teenage daughter, and defrauding dozens of investors is not a simple misunderstanding, Valerie. He replied coldly, looking down at her with absolute disgust. It is a federal felony, and your husband is going to spend the next decade wearing a bright orange jumpsuit instead of a custom-tailored suit. The wealthy guests who had stuck around to watch the drama finally realized that federal agents were actually on their way. The elite members of Atlanta high society absolutely despised being in the same room as a police investigation. A sudden frantic wave of panic swept through the crowd. People began rushing toward the exit, pushing past each other to get to their luxury cars before the authorities arrived and started asking uncomfortable questions. The beautiful garden party officially transformed into a chaotic battlefield of absolute humiliation. The elegant banquet tables were completely destroyed. The expensive crystal champagne flutes lay shattered in the grass, reflecting the afternoon sun like tiny broken diamonds. The gourmet food was scattered across the ground, getting trampled by the fleeing guests in their expensive designer shoes. The Caldwell family had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to create a perfect illusion of success, and now it was nothing more than a filthy, ruined crime scene. In the distance, the faint wailing sound of police sirens began to echo through the affluent neighborhood. The sound grew louder and more intense with every passing second. Roland squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face as the reality of his impending arrest finally crashed down on him. 3 dark federal SUVs pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, their red and blue emergency lights flashing brightly against the tall brick walls. The doors swung open, and half a dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers stepped out. They marched purposefully up the long driveway, their expressions completely stern and strictly professional. They bypassed the fleeing country club members and walked straight onto the stone patio. Roland Caldwell, one of the lead agents, barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for suspicion of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the forgery of financial documents. You have the right to remain silent and looking at this mess. I strongly suggest you use it." The agents hauled Roland to his feet and pulled his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his thick wrists echoed loudly over the quiet patio. It was the ultimate sound of defeat. Roland lowered his head, his chin resting on his chest, unable to look anyone in the eye as the agents began to march him away. Valerie let out a blood-curdling scream and tried to chase after them, but one of my security guards gently but firmly held her back. She collapsed onto the muddy grass, wailing hysterically, watching her entire life of luxury and unearned privilege being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle. The woman who had mocked my cheap linen dress was now kneeling in the dirt, completely stripped of her dignity and her wealth. Bianca was still sitting on the ground a few feet away, rocking back and forth, clutching her knees to her chest. The golden child was completely broken. Her perfect fairy tale graduation day had ended in an absolute nightmare. Her racist fiancé had cursed her out and fled the scene. Her father was being hauled away in federal handcuffs, and her family was being evicted from their own home by the sister she had always called a loser. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no prestige, and no future. The identity she had built entirely on the validation of toxic people had completely evaporated, leaving an empty, hollow shell. I did not stay to watch the federal agents drive my father away. I had seen exactly what I came to see. The toxic empire that had suffocated me for so many years was completely dismantled. Justice had been served cold, and it tasted incredibly sweet. I turned my back on my mother and my sister, leaving them to drown in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. I walked away from the ruined patio, stepping carefully over the shattered glass and the trampled silk tablecloths. Elias Thorne walked silently by my side, a silent professional guardian who had helped me execute the perfect revenge. I walked down the long, winding driveway of the massive estate. The warm Georgia sun was beginning to set, casting a beautiful golden glow over the massive property that now belonged entirely to me. I did not look back. Not even once. There was absolutely nothing left for me to see behind those gates. The screaming and crying faded into the background, replaced by the gentle rustling of the wind through the oak trees. Waiting for me at the bottom of the hill was my sleek black Maybach. My personal driver stood smartly by the rear door wearing a crisp dark suit. As I approached, he offered a warm, respectful smile and pulled the heavy door open for me. "Good evening, Miss Caldwell," he said softly, treating me with the quiet dignity my family had always denied me. "Is everything concluded up there?" "Yes," I replied, sliding into the luxurious plush leather seat. "Everything is finally finished. We can go home now." The heavy door closed, shutting out the final faint noises of the ruined party. The powerful engine purred quietly as the Maybach pulled away from the curb, leaving the dark shadow of my past in the rearview mirror forever. I leaned my head back against the soft headrest and closed my eyes, taking a deep cleansing breath. As I looked out the tinted window at the passing city lights, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my entire body. For 32 years, I had carried the heavy, crushing burden of their toxic expectations. I had let them convince me that I was not smart enough or good enough to deserve love and respect. They had forced me to wear the label of the family failure, while they paraded around wearing the unearned crowns of fake success. But the absolute truth is that you cannot build a lasting legacy on a foundation of lies and cruelty. The universe always demands to be balanced, and the truth always finds a way to the surface. Healing from the deep emotional wounds inflicted by the very people who were supposed to protect you is one of the hardest things a person can ever do in this life. It requires you to stop waiting for an apology that is never going to come. It requires you to stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally broken. It requires you to stand up, look your abusers in the eye, and take absolute control of your own narrative. I did not just survive my family, I outgrew them completely. I built a massive technology empire out of the very bricks they threw at me to break me down. I used their hatred as fuel to build my own independence. And in the end, I realized that the greatest revenge was not the $100 million check or the federal handcuffs locking around my father's wrists. The greatest revenge was simply choosing myself. It was walking away from their toxic conditional approval and building a massive, beautiful life that they could never touch. You do not have to accept the role that toxic people assign to you. You do not have to stay at the dirty corner table just because someone told you that is where you belong. You have the power to buy the entire restaurant and kick them out. Have you ever had to walk away from family to find your true self? Have you ever had to stand your ground and prove that your worth is not defined by the people who failed to love you properly? Let me know in the comments. I would absolutely love to hear your stories of resilience and unexpected transformation. If this journey resonated with you, please do not forget to like and subscribe to hear more authentic stories of growth and empowerment. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder today that they are strong enough to rewrite their own story. Thank you so much for watching and being a part of this journey. Remember that your past does not dictate your future, and you always hold the pen to your own life.